Canada doesn't often see moments like this. Moments where a political leader stops sounding like a politician and starts sounding like a human being carrying the weight of a country on their shoulders. But today, something rare happened. Something emotional. Something real. Mélanie Joly walked into a press conference expecting to talk policy, numbers, and the usual talking points. Instead, she ended up revealing just how much pressure, responsibility, and empathy she's been holding inside as Canadian families face one of their toughest winters in years. Layoffs in Sault Ste. Marie came out of nowhere, hitting right before Christmas. Families who were planning holidays suddenly found themselves staring at uncertainty and fear. And when reporters expected the usual scripted lines, Joly's voice cracked. Her breathing shifted. Her entire posture changed. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't political theater. It was the exact moment Canadians realized how deeply she feels the weight of the people she serves. In a world where politics is overshadowed by drama, division, and power struggles, Northern Pulse takes you into a moment that cut through all the noise. A moment where compassion took center stage. A moment that became bigger than steel, bigger than tariffs, and bigger than headlines. This is what really happened, and why it shocked the entire country. The nation didn't expect emotion. Not from Mélanie Joly, not in the middle of a technical press conference. But the second she started speaking about the workers in Sault Ste. Marie, everything shifted. There was no distancing herself behind political language, no barrier. No rehearsed calm. It was raw, unfiltered, and deeply human. Families lost jobs days before Christmas. Children, spouses, and entire communities were hit with uncertainty overnight. And when Joly spoke, her voice carried that pain. She wasn't reading a file. She was feeling the story. The room went completely still. Journalists lowered their pens, cameras zoomed in, and Canadians watching from home leaned closer to the screen. It wasn't weakness, it was empathy. It was a rare political moment where emotion wasn't a liability. It was a signal that someone in power was actually listening. And it made Canadians wonder, what pushed her to this point? What truth was she carrying that we hadn't heard yet? But the story behind this emotional moment goes much deeper. Before the tears, before the crack in her voice, there was the crisis that hit the steel sector with the force of a hammer. Trump's 50% tariff on Canadian steel wasn't just a policy. It was a direct hit on an industry built around supplying U.S. automakers. For decades, Canada's steel plants worked like clockwork, shipping precision-made steel across the border. That market suddenly vanished in a single decision. Workers didn't just lose contracts. They lost the foundation of their livelihood. The industry didn't adapt overnight because it couldn't. The U.S. knew exactly where Canada was vulnerable, and they squeezed that point harder than anyone expected. Rumors online claim U.S. automakers privately warned Canada months earlier that the tariff was coming, but Ottawa couldn't act on hearsay. When the tariff hit, Canadian steel shipments collapsed. Mills slowed. Shifts were cut. Families braced for impact. And through all this, Joly watched a sector she spent years defending get slammed by forces outside Canada's control. And instead of blaming, she came prepared, with proof the government was already fighting back. When Joly's voice cracked, it wasn't because she was caught off guard. It was because she'd been living in the trenches of this crisis for months. Behind the scenes, the government had already pushed hundreds of millions into the steel sector, $400 million from Ottawa and another $100 million from Ontario. This wasn't a bailout. It was a survival kit, a bridge keeping the entire system afloat long enough for industries to pivot. Workers weren't being abandoned. They were being protected long before headlines started screaming, "Crisis." The funds were meant to overhaul entire operations, new equipment, new strategies, new markets. Critics called it too late, but insiders say this money prevented thousands more layoffs. And when Joly mentioned these investments, she didn't brag, she didn't flex. She spoke like someone who's been fighting, quietly, relentlessly, and painfully, to keep families afloat. But the real strategy wasn't just saving jobs, it was transforming what Canadian steel would become next. For years, Canada depended on U.S. demand. It was efficient, but dangerous. One tariff exposed that weakness. So the government shifted gears. A new beam steel plant for Canada's massive housing build. A new plate steel plant for defense contracts and shipbuilding. Major orders already placed by Irving shipyards and Seaspan. This wasn't a reaction. It was a blueprint. Carney's Build Canadian, Buy Canadian philosophy was reshaping the steel sector from the inside out. Rumors online even suggest Canada is preparing to end long-term steel reliance on the U.S. entirely, redirecting production to domestic and allied markets by 2026. This press conference wasn't just about layoffs. It was about a structural shift that could redefine Canada's industrial future. But reporters didn't want the big picture. They wanted the controversy. And they went straight for it. If Joly's emotional moment was soft, what came next showed steel. One reporter tried dragging her into drama around F-35 pricing under Trump's tariffs. She didn't bite. She stayed calm, factual, and grounded. She simply reminded them, Canada expects full industrial benefits from Lockheed Martin. Tariffs or not. Then came the Stellantis contract controversy. Critics claim redactions were suspicious, possibly hiding something. Joly shut that down instantly. No spinning, no dodging. She simply said, if redactions are a problem, they'll be removed. Full transparency. End of story. Reporters came hunting for scandal. Joly came armed with clarity. But the toughest moment was still ahead. A journalist finally asked the question many were whispering. Why defend a pipeline when so many oil sands operations are majority owned by American companies? It was a loaded trap. Either she upset Alberta, or she upset climate advocates. She chose honesty over politics. She said the ownership structure is a real issue. She acknowledged climate responsibilities. She admitted there's more work to do. And at the same time, she stood firm in defending Alberta workers who depend on the sector today, not 5 years from now. Her answer wasn't perfect, and that's why it resonated. It was human, complex, and real. The same qualities that shaped the emotional cracks we saw earlier. But what happened next revealed the true cost of leadership. What made this press conference unforgettable wasn't just the policy, or the numbers, or even the stakes. It was the moment Canada saw the emotional and mental weight resting on Mélanie Joly's shoulders. A weight that doesn't appear in news headlines, budget documents, or political debates. A weight that only those inside government truly understand. Because leadership isn't just about signing paperwork or making announcements. It's waking up knowing thousands of families are depending on you to make the right decision. It's carrying the stress of communities that feel forgotten. It's listening to parents who don't know how they'll pay their bills. It's facing criticism from every direction, while still moving forward. Joly didn't cry because she was overwhelmed. She cracked because she cares. The layoffs in Sault Ste. Marie weren't numbers to her. They were people she'd spoken to. Families she'd heard from, workers she'd been fighting for behind closed doors. Her emotional moment came from months of absorbing fear, anger, and heartbreak from Canadians who felt the ground slipping beneath them. And that's the part viewers felt. That's why the clip spread so quickly. In a world where politics often feels cold, scripted, and distant, Canadians saw something warm, real, and vulnerable. They saw a leader with heart. They saw someone who didn't hide behind talking points when the moment got heavy. Someone who let the public see the human being behind the job title.
someone who refused to pretend that losing jobs before Christmas is just an economic challenge. This section of the press conference transformed Joly's entire image. She wasn't just a minister anymore. She was someone who carried the emotional cost of leadership with honesty. And that changed the tone of the entire discussion about Canada's response to U.S. pressure. But even with all the emotion, what she said next reminded Canadians that the fight is far from over.
After the emotional moment passed, Joly returned to something firm and powerful. Canada is not surrendering, not to 50% tariffs, not to foreign pressure, not to economic intimidation. She made it clear that the government is pulling every lever: federal funds, provincial cooperation, domestic reinvestment, and new market strategies to protect Canadian workers. This wasn't a plea for sympathy. It was a message of resistance. A reminder that when Washington acts recklessly, Canada adapts, it rebuilds, it pivots, and it refuses to let families fall through the cracks. The press conference revealed something deeper about Canada's future, a future where emotional honesty and strategic toughness can coexist, a future where leaders like Joly remind the world that Canada may be polite, but it's not passive. And that brought us to the final message. What happened today wasn't just a press conference. It was a national moment, a moment that reminded Canadians that leadership with empathy still exists, that the people in power still feel the weight of every layoff, every struggle, and every family in crisis. Mélanie Joly didn't just speak, she connected. She didn't just explain, she felt. And with Northern Pulse bringing these stories forward, Canadians can see the truth behind the headlines, that this government is fighting, adapting, and refusing to abandon the people who keep this country strong. Canada isn't backing down. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever.